In the early months of 1823, roughly 250 British settlers stood on a beach on the Caribbean coast of Central America and looked for a city that did not exist. They had paid for land there. Some had sold farms in Scotland to buy it. They carried deeds, signed and sealed, to plots in a capital called St. Joseph, a city they had read about in a 300-page guidebook. Broad boulevards, a domed cathedral, a theatre, a parliament building, banks along a river running with gold-bearing sand. Among them were a shoemaker who had been appointed official shoemaker to the Princess of Poyais, a City of London clerk commissioned as an officer in the Poyaisian army, and a banker carrying a commission to manage the Bank of Poyais. There was no city. There was no parliament, no cathedral, no bank, no road, no clearing. There was jungle, mangrove swamp, and a stretch of shore where an earlier English attempt at settlement had rotted back into the trees decades before. The rainy season was beginning. The nearest European settlement was several days away by sea, and nobody there was expecting them. Of the 250 or so who sailed, fewer than a third would come home. They had been sold a country, not a bad investment in a real country, a country. Its flag, its currency, its constitution, its offices of state, its land registry, and its national debt had all been invented by one Scotsman and sold in London to people who checked as carefully as anyone in 1822 knew how to check. His name was Gregor MacGregor, and this is the story of what remains the most audacious financial fraud ever attempted: the invention, sale, and slow public death of the Republic of Poyais. And before we go further, a word about why this story sits on a British History Channel rather than in a curiosity cabinet. Poyais was not an eccentric episode at the margins of the London market. It was floated by a London banking house, listed on the London Stock Exchange, sold to British families through British newspapers, and it happened at the height of a boom in which Britain exported more capital faster to less well-understood places than at any previous point in its history. The country that would spend the next century as the world's banker was, in 1822, still learning what that involved. And Poyais is the most expensive single tuition fee it ever paid, measured in lives rather than pounds. It is a story with 4 things this channel cares about: a mechanism nobody had used before or has quite matched since, not a false company, but a false sovereign. A bond issue in a fictional nation's name, traded on the London Stock Exchange alongside the real debt of real countries. A body count. And an ending that will make you put your head in your hands. Because of everyone in this story, the man who did it is the one it worked out for. Start with the man, because the strangest thing about MacGregor is how much of him was real. He was born in 1786 into a Highland family with a genuine and colourful pedigree, a grandson of a soldier known as Gregor the Beautiful, and a clan connection to Rob Roy MacGregor that he would deploy for the rest of his life. At 16, he bought a commission in the British Army. He served in the Peninsular War under Wellington's command structure, though not with distinction, and left after a series of disputes with fellow officers that suggest a man who could not tolerate being ranked. Then, in 1811, he did something unusual. He sold up and sailed for Venezuela to join the wars of independence against Spain. And here is where the honest account gets complicated, because his South American career was not fraudulent. He fought, genuinely and at times very well, under Francisco de Miranda and then Simón Bolívar. He married a cousin of Bolívar's. He led a retreat across country under pursuit that contemporaries and later historians alike judged a genuinely skillful feat of arms. He was made a general. Whatever else he became, MacGregor spent a decade as a real soldier in a real revolution, and the medals were earned. That matters enormously for what follows, and it is the first lesson of this episode arriving early. The most effective frauds are not built by outsiders inventing a life. They are built by insiders spending a real reputation. MacGregor did not need to fake being a general, he was one. Everything he sold in London was underwritten by a career that would survive any check a London investor could actually perform. Then, in 1820, he acquired the thing that turned a soldier into a country. On the Mosquito coast, the eastern shore of what is now Nicaragua and Honduras, lived the Mosquito people, whose leaders had held a long, semi-formal relationship with the British Crown, styling themselves kings and receiving British recognition of a sort. In April 1820, at a meeting attended by a good deal of rum, King George Frederick Augustus I granted MacGregor a tract of territory, something in the region of 8 million acres along the Black River. Now, hold this carefully because it is the hinge of the entire deception. The grant was, in some meaningful sense, real. There was a document. There was a chief with a plausible claim to grant it, whose predecessors had made similar grants to Britons before. MacGregor did not forge his title. What he did was describe it. The land itself was undeveloped tropical coast, dense forest, swamp, seasonal flooding, endemic malaria and yellow fever, and no infrastructure of any kind. The British had tried a settlement in the region in the previous century. It had failed and been abandoned, and its remains were quietly rotting in the undergrowth. Every fraud this channel has covered contains a kernel of truth that makes the whole edifice checkable. Enron had a real gas business. The railway mania had real railways. Overend Gurney had a real Quaker name. Poyais had a real land grant from a real king, and it was that single verifiable fact, a document a London solicitor could examine and pronounce genuine, that carried everything else. Because what MacGregor built on top of it was pure invention, and the scale of the invention is what makes this story unique in the history of fraud. He did not sell an investment in a scheme. He constructed a functioning fictional state and sold citizenship in it. Poyais had a name and a flag. It had a constitution and a system of government, with MacGregor as cazique, a Mosquito-derived title he rendered into English as prince-like ruler, carefully avoiding king so as not to give offence in London. It had a civil service with named departments. It had a land registry issuing deeds by the acre. It had an army with regiments and uniforms. It had a legation in London, a physical office with staff issuing papers to prospective emigrants. It had a currency. MacGregor had Poyaisian dollars printed by a genuine Scottish banknote printer, and settlers were encouraged to exchange their British pounds for them before departure, which is a detail worth sitting with, because it meant many arrived on that beach holding money that had never been legal tender anywhere on earth. And it had a book. In 1822, there appeared in London a handsome volume of some 350 pages, a sketch of the Mosquito shore, including the territory of Poyais, by one Thomas Strangeways, captain of the 1st Native Poyais Regiment and aide-de-camp to His Highness the Cacique. Captain Strangeways did not exist. The book was MacGregor's, in whole or substantial part. It is a masterpiece of its kind, and its method is worth studying, because it is the method of every convincing fabrication since. It does not oversell. That is the first thing a modern reader notices. A crude forger would have written a paradise. Strangeways writes a sober regional survey, complete with tedious passages on soil composition, rainfall tables, the customs of neighboring peoples, and, crucially, the drawbacks. The book warns that the work will be hard, that settlers must be industrious, that certain areas are less suitable. It reads exactly like the honest reports of real colonies, because the man writing it had read a great many of them. Into that dull, credible frame he then set the details that sold the country. The climate so healthy that British soldiers stationed there had recovered from illnesses contracted at home, soil producing 3 maize harvests a year. Water in the rivers carrying gold in commercially interesting quantities, forests of mahogany, fisheries. Friendly and industrious natives willing to work for wages who would greet British settlers with enthusiasm. And a capital, St. Joseph, already built and populated by some 2,000 people, with paved streets, a cathedral, a theatre, a domed rotunda, a Bank of Poyais, and a detail of real genius, the observation that the town was rather short of tradesmen, so that a skilled artisan emigrating now would find himself in immediate demand. That last touch is the fraudster's signature. It does not merely describe an opportunity, it explains why the opportunity has not already been taken. Every convincing scheme, in every era, must answer the question, if this is so good, why is it available to me? And Poyais answered it perfectly. The country was real, developed and prosperous, but new, and it needed people. MacGregor then monetized his invention along every axis a real state possesses. He sold land, initially at around 1 shilling and 3p an acre, rising as demand grew on printed certificates. He sold offices, commissions in the Poyaisian army and navy, posts in the civil service, judicial appointments and honours. A London clerk could become a colonel. A shoemaker could become official shoemaker to the princess. These were sold cheaply, and they did double duty. They raised money, and they gave the purchaser a stake in believing. And then, in October 1822, he did the thing that separates Poyais from every other fraud in this series. He issued sovereign debt. Through the respectable London banking house of Sir John Perring, Shaw, Barber and Company, the government of Poyais floated a loan of £200,000 at 6%, secured on the revenues of the country, the customs duties, the land sales, the gold. The bonds were issued in the standard form, with the standard coupons, and they were listed and traded on the London Stock Exchange, alongside the debt of Colombia, Chile, Peru, and Mexico. Say that plainly, because it is almost too strange to absorb. For a period in the 1820s, the sovereign bonds of a country that did not exist were bought and sold on the London market, at prices, by professional investors, in the same room and by the same men who traded the debt of real nations. Which raises the question this whole episode exists to answer. How? The answer has 3 parts, and all 3 recur in every bubble this channel covers. First, the information vacuum. In 1822, there was no way for a London investor to check Poyais. Central America was 6 to 10 weeks away by sail. There were no telegraphs, no consular reports on the Mosquito coast, no reference works a clerk could consult, and, critically, no reason to expect one. The region genuinely was poorly mapped and thinly documented. An investor doing his honest best could examine the land grant, which was genuine, consult the guidebook, which was thorough, verify MacGregor's military record, which was real, observe the London legation, which existed, and note that a respectable banking house was handling the loan. Every check available returned sound. That is the deepest and most uncomfortable lesson here, and we will come back to it. Due diligence is not a search for truth. It is a search through the available records, and a sufficiently ambitious liar can manufacture the records. Second, the moment. Poyais did not appear in a vacuum. It appeared at the peak of a genuine mania and rode it. Between 1822 and 1825, the newly independent states of Latin America came to London in a queue: Colombia, Chile, Peru, Mexico, Brazil, Guatemala, issuing bonds to a British public flush with post-war capital, and desperate for yield above the 3% available on government consols. Mining companies for South American silver were floated by the dozen. It was, in every structural sense, the railway mania 30 years early and 6,000 miles away, and it ended the same way in the crash of 1825, which took down dozens of country banks and forced the Bank of England into the rescue operations that made its reputation, as viewers of our Overend Gurney episode will recall. Inside such a boom, a new Central American country seeking capital was not an anomaly. It was the 14th one that year. The mania supplied Poyais with camouflage. MacGregor's genius was not in inventing a country, but in inventing it precisely when London had stopped finding new countries surprising. Third, and this is the part usually missed, MacGregor was selling to two different audiences with two different weaknesses, and each validated the other. To the city he sold bonds, a financial instrument bought by men who never intended to go anywhere, whose only question was yield and security. To ordinary families he sold land and offices, a life bought by people who intended to sail. And each group took the other as evidence. The settlers reasoned that if the London Stock Exchange was pricing Poyaisian debt, the country was obviously real. The bondholders reasoned that if hundreds of hard-headed Scottish families were selling their farms to emigrate there, the country was obviously real. Neither group knew that both were looking at the same man's imagination. That is a structure worth naming, because it recurs. When two independent-seeming groups each cite the other's participation as proof, the appearance of consensus can be manufactured by one actor standing behind both. It is the oldest trick in confidence work, executed here at national scale. Before the ships, two more pieces of the machine deserve examination: the money that flowed back and the peculiar sales operation that filled the passenger lists. Take the bonds first, because there is a detail in them that separates MacGregor from an ordinary swindler. The 1822 loan raised something in the region of £200,000, a very large sum, though not the largest of that season's Latin American issues. And MacGregor did with it exactly what a genuine sovereign borrower would have done, which is to say, he serviced it. For a period, The coupons on Poyaisian debt were paid. Think about what that means mechanically. Interest on the bonds was paid out of the proceeds of the bonds and the land sales, new money arriving, recycled to earlier investors as though it were revenue from a functioning country. If that structure sounds familiar, it should. It is the same arithmetic as Hudson's dividends out of capital in our Railway Mania episode. And the same arithmetic Madoff ran on a vastly larger scale a century and a half later. Paying the coupon is what buys the time because a bond that pays looks like a country that earns. There is a second reason it mattered here specifically. Every quarter that Poyaisian coupons were met was a quarter in which the London market had documentary evidence, real payments into real accounts from a real paying agent, that the revenues described in the prospectus were arriving. It was the strongest possible corroboration of the fiction, and it was manufactured with the victim's own capital. Now the sales operation, which was, in its way, more impressive than the bonds. MacGregor did not simply advertise. He built a recruitment apparatus with the texture of a real emigration scheme. There were regional agents on commission across Scotland, men who were themselves often sincere believers, which is important, because a salesman who has been deceived sells with a conviction no liar can counterfeit. There was the London legation with its staff and its papers. There were printed application forms, land certificates issued in sequence with a registry number, and letters of appointment on headed paper for those buying offices. And there was the crucial psychological device, scarcity with a deadline. Land in the desirable districts around St. Joseph was, prospective emigrants were told, going fast. The good plots near the capital would be taken by the earlier ships. The price per acre was raised more than once during the campaign, which functioned as proof of demand. Nobody wanted to be on the third boat and get the swamp, a fear that turned out, in the bleakest possible way, to be well-founded. That combination, sincere intermediaries, official-looking documentation, rising prices and a closing window, is the standard architecture of high-pressure selling, and MacGregor assembled it in 1822 without any of it having a name yet. There is one more element, and it is the darkest touch in the whole design. He encouraged settlers to convert their savings into Poyaisian dollars before embarking at a rate he set. Consider what that achieved. It stripped the emigrants of any means of buying passage home or supplies on arrival, ensuring they were wholly dependent on a country that did not exist. It converted their remaining wealth into paper that cost him almost nothing to print. And it removed, at a stroke, the possibility that a settler might land, see the situation, and simply pay a passing captain to take him back to Belize. Whether MacGregor thought that far ahead is unknowable, and is one of the genuine open questions his biographers argue over. But the effect was to strand them, and it is the single hardest detail in this story to read charitably. So the settlers came. They were overwhelmingly Scottish. MacGregor recruited hard in Edinburgh and the Highlands, where his clan name carried weight and where emigration was already a familiar answer to hard times. They were not the desperate poor. They were the respectable middling sort. The people with something to sell, skilled tradesmen, farmers, small merchants, a doctor, a lawyer, clerks. Several were substantially invested, men who had liquidated everything in Scotland to buy Poyaisian acres and take up Poyaisian offices. The first ship, the Honduras packet, sailed from London in September 1822 with about 70 aboard. The second, the Kennersley Castle, left Leith in January 1823 with close to 200. There was a send-off. There was cheering. The Honduras packet reached the Mosquito coast in late 1822 and put its passengers ashore near the mouth of the Black River, where the guidebook placed the approaches to St. Joseph. What happened next is documented in survivors' accounts, and it is, in its quiet way, one of the most desolate passages in the history of British emigration. They found no port. They found no town. They walked and searched and found the overgrown remains of the abandoned earlier settlement, a few collapsed structures being taken back by the forest. They assumed at first that they had been put ashore at the wrong place. The ship's captain, having discharged his contract, sailed away. When the Kennersley Castle arrived some months later and landed 200 more people in the same place, the two groups compared documents and arrived slowly at the only remaining explanation. Then the rains came, and then the fever. The Mosquito coast in that season is a malarial environment, and these were people with no acquired resistance, no shelter beyond improvised huts and tents, no medical support beyond one doctor's bag, and supplies calculated for a short passage to a functioning town. Malaria and yellow fever moved through the camp. The doctor died. Several settlers, it is recorded, took their own lives, among them the London banker who had come out to run the Bank of Poyais. We will not dwell further, and there is a reason for the restraint. This is a story about a financial mechanism, and the people on that beach are not colour for it. What matters is the arithmetic, stated once, plainly, of roughly 250 settlers who sailed for Poyais. Something in the region of 180 are believed to have died. Fewer than 50 ever saw Britain again. Rescue came by accident. A passing schooner carried word to British Honduras, Belize, and the authorities there sent a vessel. The survivors, most of them too ill to stand, were evacuated to Belize, where many more died. A remnant was eventually carried home to Britain, arriving in the autumn of 1823 to a country that had, by then, begun to understand what had happened. There is a detail from the aftermath that deserves recording because it is the only redemptive thing in the entire episode. The superintendent at Belize and the small British community there took in several hundred desperately ill strangers who had no claim on them, no money that anyone would accept, and no government willing to acknowledge responsibility. They organized medical care, food, and eventually passage home. Nothing in the story of Poyais was competently arranged except the rescue, and that was arranged by people who had never heard of the place until the survivors arrived. And now the part of the story that turns it from a tragedy into a study of accountability, because you would expect this to be where MacGregor is destroyed. He was not in Britain. As the survivors were dying, he had left for France, and by the time the truth reached London, he was beyond reach of any immediate consequence. What he did next is genuinely difficult to believe. In Paris in 1825, he did it again. He established a new operation, secured backing from a French company, and began recruiting settlers for Poyais, the same invented country, marketed to a French public that had not read the British newspapers. This time, the plot was undone by bureaucracy rather than by conscience. a suspicious French official noticed that a great many passports were being sought for a destination he could not find in any atlas, and the authorities intervened before the ships sailed. MacGregor was arrested and tried in France in 1826 on charges relating to the fraud. He was acquitted. The French court, wrestling with a set of facts no legal system had been designed for, could not satisfactorily establish the crime. Was it fraud to describe a territory to which one held a genuine grant? Which specific misrepresentation on which document to which victim constituted the offence? The prosecution struggled. The case was muddied and MacGregor walked out of the courtroom. He returned to London and, with a persistence that is almost admirable if you can forget the beach, continued to work variations on the scheme for another decade. Fresh Poyaisian land certificates were issued in 1827. Another loan was attempted in the 1830s. Each attempt was smaller and less successful than the last, as the story became better known, but none of them landed him in a British dock. And there was no British prosecution, ever. That fact deserves a moment because it is not an oversight. It is the same gap this channel has now documented in 4 centuries. Fraud law in 1820s. Britain was rudimentary. There was no securities regulation, no prospectus law, no offence of issuing a misleading offering document. The victims were scattered, mostly ruined, many dead, and the survivors had every reason to want the humiliation forgotten rather than rehearsed in court. Some of them, remarkably, continued to defend MacGregor publicly, insisting that the cacique had been deceived by his own agents, that the failure lay with the settlers' unpreparedness, that the country would yet be built. That is not stupidity. That is the mind protecting itself from the size of what it has lost, and it appears in the aftermath of nearly every large fraud. It is worth asking what happened to the bonds, since they were the instrument that made this a financial story rather than merely a colonial disaster. They did what the debt of a non-existent country must eventually do. They stopped paying and became worthless paper. But note the cover they had. The great Latin American loan boom collapsed in the crash of 1825, and the debt of Peru, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, and Guatemala went into default alongside Poyais. Real countries stopped paying at the same moment the imaginary one did. That is a genuinely disquieting fact, and it is worth sitting with. For a period in the mid-1820s, a London investor holding Poyaisian bonds and one holding Peruvian bonds were in materially the same position, unpaid, holding paper on a distant government they could not reach, with no realistic prospect of enforcement. The fiction was indistinguishable from the reality, not because Poyais was well disguised at that point, but because the reality had become as unrecoverable as the fiction. When a whole asset class fails together, the fraud within it is camouflaged by the honest failures around it, and the losses look like market conditions rather than crime. MacGregor's ending is the detail that makes people put the book down. In 1838, he moved to Venezuela, the country he had genuinely helped to liberate a quarter of a century earlier. He applied for restoration of his rank and citizenship, submitting his service record. The Venezuelan government considered it and granted it. He was confirmed as a general of division, with back pay and a pension, and lived out his years in Caracas as a respected veteran of the Wars of Independence. He died there in December 1845, and was buried in Caracas Cathedral with full military honors, the funeral attended by government ministers and the president himself. 2 questions remain before the lessons, and both are more interesting than they first appear. The first is the one everybody asks. Did he believe it? It is tempting to assume pure cynicism, and the Poyaisian dollars argue for it. But his biographers are genuinely divided, and the case for partial self-deception is not weak. Consider the pattern of his life. He had spent a decade among men who were quite literally inventing countries. Bolivar and Miranda were creating republics out of colonies, drawing borders, designing flags and constitutions for states that did not yet exist. In that world, a general with a land grant declaring a nation was not obviously mad. It was the going business of the continent. Several of MacGregor's contemporaries attempted comparable, if smaller, private colonization schemes. And there is the fact that he kept going. A pure calculator, having extracted the money and seen the survivors return, would have stopped, changed his name and enjoyed the proceeds. MacGregor tried Poyais again in France, then again in London, then again in the 1830s, each time with diminishing returns and increasing personal risk. That is not obviously the behavior of a man running a con. It has the flavor of a man who could not let go of a country he had come to inhabit. The most credible reading, and the one this channel will offer without insisting on it, is that both were true and the proportions shifted. The grant may have begun as a genuine, if wildly over-optimistic, colonial venture. The guidebook's inventions were then required to raise the capital to make it real. And once settlers were sailing toward a city he knew was not there, the distinction between believing and lying had ceased to matter to anyone standing on that beach. Which brings the second question. Why did nobody check? Not the settlers, they had no means. But London had means. There were merchants trading to the Caribbean, naval officers who knew the Mosquito coast, and the Admiralty's own charts. Somebody in that city could have said, within a week, that there was no town of 2,000 people at the mouth of the Black River. The answer is that nobody was assigned to. This is the structural point, and it survives the 2 centuries between then and now intact. In a boom, the incentive to verify is inversely proportional to the appetite to participate. The banking house earning fees on the loan had no reason to commission an investigation that might kill it. The newspapers carrying the emigration advertisements had no reason either. The agents were paid on commission. The prospective settlers were not equipped. And the one group with both the knowledge and the motive to expose it, rival promoters floating competing Latin American ventures, were busy floating their own and had every reason not to invite scrutiny of the general category they were all selling. A market where everyone profits from the story and nobody is paid to test it will not test it. That is not a moral failing of the individuals involved. It is an absence of a role. The entire apparatus we now take for granted, auditors, ratings agencies, regulators, financial journalism, short sellers, exists to create somebody whose interest lies in the story being false. In 1822, that person did not exist, and Poyais is what the gap looked like. So, what should we take from Poyais? 6 things. First, the mechanism, which is the reason this case is unique. Every other fraud in this series sold a false claim about a real thing: Enron's earnings, Overend's solvency, Hudson's dividends, the gold rings cornered market. MacGregor sold a false thing entire. And the striking discovery is that a wholly invented object is not harder to sell than a partly false one. In some ways it is easier, because there is no inconvenient reality underneath to contradict the story. There were no Poyaisian accounts to be caught misstating, no Poyaisian harvest to come in short. The fabrication was complete, and completeness gave it internal consistency. Watch for that. An opportunity with no awkward details, no rough edges, no bad quarters, may not be well run. It may be unencumbered by existence. Second, verisimilitude is the weapon, not exaggeration. The sketch of the Mosquito shore worked because it included the boring parts and admitted the drawbacks. Every subsequent generation of fraud has rediscovered this. The false document that convinces is the one with the errata, the caveats, the modest projections, and the section headed Risks. A story polished to a shine invites suspicion. A story with plausible blemishes invites belief. When you are being sold something, notice whether the drawbacks you are shown are the ones that would actually matter. Third, due diligence checks records, and records can be manufactured. This is the hardest lesson in the episode, and the least comfortable, because it does not resolve into a rule you can follow. The investors and settlers of 1822 did check. The grant was genuine. The general was genuine. The bank was genuine. The office existed, and the book was thorough. Every reachable source returned true, and every one of them had been placed there or repurposed by the same hand. The only check that would have worked was the one nobody could perform: going to look. When the entire evidence base for a decision comes, however indirectly, from a single interested party, you do not have 5 sources. You have one source wearing 5 coats. Fourth, the 2 audience trick, and the false consensus it builds. The bondholders trusted the settlers' commitment. The settlers trusted the bondholders' money. Neither knew both were reading MacGregor. If you find yourself reassured that other, quite different people also believe, sophisticated institutions on one side, ordinary families on the other, trace where each group's information actually came from before you count them as independent. Manufactured consensus is the most powerful instrument in this entire catalogue, because it disarms precisely the caution that would otherwise save you. And fifth, the one that should sit uncomfortably, the outcome. 180 people are dead, and the man who caused it received a state funeral and a general's pension in a cathedral. There is no justice in the ending of this story, and this channel is not going to manufacture one. What there is instead is a pattern, the same one traced through the Overend director's acquittal, through Hudson never facing a charge, through the gold rings untouched conspirators, through the 67 years between the corner and the statute that would have caught it. The law arrives late, always. It is built out of the wreckage of the disaster before last. Poyais is the extreme case, a fraud so far outside anything the law had imagined that no court in 2 countries could work out which offence precisely had been committed. Britain eventually acquired the machinery: prospectus law, company law, securities regulation, the offence of fraudulent misrepresentation with teeth. Every clause of it exists because somebody, once, did something for which there was then no name. And there is a 6th thing, which is less a lesson than a warning about how this story gets told. Poyais is usually served up as comedy. The shoemaker with his royal appointment, the Poyaisian dollars, the man who invented a country. It has the shape of a farce, and it is regularly listed among history's most amusing hoaxes. Even the phrase most commonly attached to it, the man who sold a country that didn't exist, invites a smile. Resist that because the comedy is doing something. It relocates the story from the beach to the drawing room, and it quietly makes McGregor the protagonist, the audacious rogue, the magnificent liar, the one whose nerve we are invited to admire. Told that way, the settlers become the joke's punchline, the gullible, the ones who fell for it. They were not gullible. They were people who performed every check available to them in 1822 and were defeated by a man who had manufactured the evidence. They sold real farms for real deeds registered in a real ledger, backed by a genuine royal grant, endorsed by a London banking house, described in a sober book, and validated by a bond trading on the London Stock Exchange. Anyone in this audience dropped into Edinburgh in 1822 with the same information would have had no reliable way to reach a different conclusion. And 180 of them died of it. That is not a farce. It is the largest body count in this channel's entire catalogue of financial disasters, larger than Overend Gurney, larger than the Railway Mania, larger than Enron. The South Sea bubble ruined more people. Poyais killed more. So the story is told here as what it is, not a caper, but the extreme demonstration of a permanent condition. That verification has limits, that documents can be built to satisfy every check you know how to make, and that when the checking runs out, what is left is trust. Usually, trust is well placed and the system works. Occasionally, it meets a man like McGregor, and the cost is not measured in money. The comedy is how we make that bearable. It is worth noticing that we do it, and worth declining to. A last footnote on the name. Poyais took its title from the Paya or Poyais people of the region, whom the guidebook described as loyal subjects eager to labor for British settlers. They were a real people, with a real territory, who had not been consulted, were not subjects of anyone, and whose land had been described to strangers as a workforce. In a story with a great many victims, they are the ones who appear in no ledger at all. Not investors, not settlers, simply inhabitants of a place that was sold over their heads to people who never arrived in any numbers to trouble them. It is the smallest injustice in the episode, and the only one nobody has ever bothered to count. The Mosquito coast is still there. The Black River still runs out through mangroves into the Caribbean, and the stretch of shore where 250 people looked for a cathedral is jungle, as it was then and as it had always been. There is no monument. Most of the people who died there have no recorded grave. Somewhere in a British archive there is a bond certificate, correctly engraved, properly sealed, promising 6% on the revenues of the Republic of Poyais, a debt of a country that never existed, issued against the customs receipts of a port that was never built and traded for a while in London by men who had checked. Sources and method. This account draws on the surviving settlers' testimony collected after the 1823 evacuation and the contemporary reporting of the returning ships, the text of the 1822 sketch of the Mosquito shore published under the name Thomas Strangeways, the prospectus and stock exchange records of the 1822 Poyaisian loan, issued through Sir John Perring's house, the record of MacGregor's 1826 trial in France, his Venezuelan service and pension records, and the modern scholarly and biographical literature on the Poyais scheme and on the Latin American loan boom of 1822 to 1825. Where the record is genuinely contested, above all the exact number who sailed and who died, which contemporary sources give with meaningful variation, and how far MacGregor believed his own promotion as against knowingly fabricating it, which his biographers still dispute, this video gives the ranges and the competing readings rather than the most dramatic single figure. The land grant from the Mosquito king is treated as authentic because the documentary evidence supports it. It is the description of that land, not the title to it, that constituted the fraud,